Theology, politics, and principles of economic justice often overlap. I try to not bring politics into the pulpit, so I'm not going to tell you which party is right or wrong today, or which party you should support or promote. I'm going to remind you that we need Jesus to rule here on earth one day so we can have it be perfect, because none of the parties are going to get it perfect. Christians, however, regardless of what party they're a member of, should be united in their desire for fairness in the economic realm, because we understand that God is a God of justice and mercy. But the challenge comes when we try to figure out how to be fair. And the challenge ought to come more so for us today than in the big policy picture, is how can we be fair in our personal lives? Now, I'm not telling you shouldn't vote. We got big elections coming up next fall. And some of those issues of economic justice are going to play into people's decisions to vote. I'm not saying they shouldn't. But don't vote and think that you've done your economic or your duty in economic justice by voting for people. I want you to do your economic justice duty by loving your neighbors as you interact. Part of the problem with economic justice is that sinful people are filled with greed, and often greedy people end up using the quest for justice to enrich themselves rather than to really help those in need. Other times, people with righteous intentions end up unwittingly helping greedy people without realizing it. So even in that realm of politics, we've seen examples where people have been exploited. I don't want to get into politics too much, but if I wanted to, I can give you historic examples where both the major parties have failed. That's not where I really want to go this morning. I want us to look at our hearts, not to look at what somebody else is doing. And too often when we bring politics into it, we look at what somebody else is doing. By the way, I also want you to be very careful. If somebody else is a member of a different political party than you are, that you don't just jump to the conclusion that they don't care about economic justice. Because I know people in both the major parties and people that are independents that all care about economic justice. They just view the solutions in a different way. Now, those of you that know me when I'm not standing behind the pulpit know that I've got opinions about economics, about business. I mean, I'm a businessman as well as a pastor. I understand economics a little bit. But you know what? There's people that understand economics and have economic degrees that think that there should be different solutions than what I think there should be. And some of those people genuinely care, just like I do. So let's love others. Now we can have political discussions about how to best help people that are in need. It's not wrong to have those discussions, especially when we care about people in need. But recognize there's people that also care about people in need that might have a different opinion. Let's show grace. Let me say that again, let's show grace. Yet another reason, and I mentioned this before, yet another reason to look forward to the return of Jesus Christ. For him to rule and live here on earth. Because I know he'll be a just ruler. And I know he'll have all the right answers. We're going to come up short trying to come up with the right answers. our leaders are going to come up short trying to have the right answers. Yet another reason to see how wonderful Jesus is. Today, however, we are going to look at Joseph. We're going to look at Pharaoh. We're going to look at them during the famine and see an example of a powerful ruler using his strength in a way that provides for the needs of the people without becoming too greedy. I don't want us to necessarily look at what Pharaoh and Joseph did and say, this is what our policymakers should implement. That's not where we should go with this. But what I do want us to look at it and say is, guess what? They had an opportunity to be greedy, and they set aside greed for their neighbors. That's what should really challenge us this morning. So regardless of what side of the economic equation we are on, we used the illustration earlier about whether you're the landlord or whether you're the tenant, the renter. If you give the perspective of the one side, oh, I understand why the rent's so high. And you give the perspective of the other side and you say, why is the rent so high? All those things when we're trying to find that justice. But regardless of what side of the economic equation we are on, let us as Christians learn from the example of Pharaoh and Joseph and be Christ-like and care about the needs of others. Let us be people of fairness and compassion while also not enabling greed in others. So the challenge is, let's not be greedy ourselves, but the one area where you're going to the ballot box, I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I'm just saying there is a to say let's not enable the greed of others. But there's going to be people on both sides of the political spectrum who are going to vote the way they do because they don't want to enable the greed of others. So don't just assume that people are being evil when they're letting economic justice guide their vote, regardless of which side of the political aisle you're on. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us as we look into your word. Help us to understand your word a bit better, but also help us with principles of who you are and of your love and your compassion. And help us as we love you to also love one another. Help us to be people who care about our neighbors and who put that care into practice. In Jesus' name, amen. Back to Genesis chapter 47. Let us not forget why Jacob and his family went to Egypt. There was a severe famine. In fact, it reminds me of the people moving during the Great Depression in the 1930s. I don't think any of us were alive during that time, but many of your parents and grandparents were. Many of us have heard stories about that time from people who were there. But that severe famine at the time of Jacob, a reminder of how critical things can be and how principles of economic justice affect not just people's bank accounts, but people's stomachs. I want us to reflect on that for a moment. I used that illustration before the message about rent. If someone have a house and they have to live in the car, but they got food and plenty of clothes. This last week, living in a car would have been terrible. During the summertime, however, fall and the spring, I I've known people that have lived in a car or lived in a van. I even knew people who lived in a van when it was as cold as it was this last week, and they had heaters and they were able to get by. In fact, I knew of a couple of people who lived in a van for a year to save up money so that they could take a trip to Europe, and they did. So there are ways people can get by even if they don't have a house to live in. But people need food, they need clothes. I want to remind you, when they have those needs, we have an additional obligation to try to meet those needs as we show love for our neighbors. Keep that in the back of your mind, not just as we look at this message, but as you live your life and you see people in need. Because the principles of economic justice should remind us of the passage where having food and raiment, be content. But also realizing people need food and raiment. Those are the basic needs, food and clothes. Anyway, we come to Genesis 47, verse 13. It says, now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. That word languish is a big word, but it is a very descriptive word. It means to faint or burn. It had the idea of becoming exhausted because you were in a frenzy. When I think of fainting, I sometimes think of people they're so weak that they just call. This is the idea of people just striving and going hard and then finally dropping. They were trying to get food. They were trying to survive. And they were losing that battle for survival. This was a time of desperation. And I don't want to, that word's too light. That word desperation is too light. But it was a time of beyond desperation for so many people. It is not unusual, however, for certain people to be able to profit at the expense of others during tough economic times. The situation in Egypt and Canaan was no exception. In fact, Pharaoh and Joseph are able to profit a lot during this time, not unlike other times in history. During the Great Depression, there were people that became very wealthy, while others were languishing. But while Pharaoh was enriching himself, he was also helping many others. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. While Pharaoh was enriching himself, he was also helping many others. Doesn't that fit well with that second greatest command to love your neighbor as yourself? To be able to be enriched and then to give. I think of what it says in the New Testament. Let he that stole steal no more. Let him labor with his hands that he may help others. Labor with your hands so that you can become a bit enriched, so you can help others. That's an economic principle that we can get from the Scriptures. We should not want to just enrich ourselves so that we can live in luxury. It isn't wrong, however, to want to enrich yourselves, to have a little extra, especially if you're using that extra to help others. That is a biblical principle that goes far beyond politics. And we're going to see that's what Pharaoh and Joseph end up doing. They end up enriching themselves so they can help those in need. Verses 14 through 22 of Genesis 47. And Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they brought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Pharaoh and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, and the flocks, and the herds, and the donkeys, and their livestock to Joseph. And Joseph gave them food for their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities, from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. The people lose all their possessions, but they're alive. When you're languishing, when you're starving, you're just thankful to have food in your belly. I don't think any of us realize the extreme these people had reached and how desperate they were for food. Your possessions don't mean anything when you're starving, when your life is at stake. We live in a land of vast prosperity. It is so easy to take for granted and to put too much focus on stuff. Again, I'm not saying stuff is wrong, especially if you can use that stuff to help others. It wasn't wrong for Pharaoh to accumulate all this stuff, especially when he's using that stuff to help others. So what does that do? That gives us a responsibility as people with stuff. We are blessed with stuff. That's not evil. But we have a responsibility. Let's help others. Pharaoh has enriched himself, but he will use these riches to care for others. That's the principle of stewardship. That's the principle of compassion. Jesus encouraged us to be good stewards. He gave the parable of the talents, and he encouraged those with the talents to grow their talents, to get more talents. So gaining possessions is not an evil thing. Jesus encouraged that in that parable of the talents. But Jesus also taught compassion, caring for the needs of the others. He fed the multitude, the thousands of people that would come, and they were hungry. Now, they weren't languishing. This was just they would have missed a meal because they came to listen to him, and he still had compassion for them. Even if they would have just missed one meal. Or maybe they had traveled, so maybe it would have been a couple meals. I don't know for certain. The point is, he had compassion when they weren't even languishing as bad as people in a famine. He had compassion. Jesus had compassion. We need to have compassion. These are biblical principles for us to live by. It's not wrong to accumulate wealth. The parable of the talents, the stewardship principle, shows us it's not wrong to accumulate wealth, but there's a principle of compassion that should also be there as you accumulate that wealth. How is Pharaoh going to do with that? That's where we're going to be at as we continue to go through this chapter. In fact, you might ask, Pharaoh had all this food because Joseph had told him how to accumulate it. Joseph was in charge of that food. Remember, they had the good years, so they saved up all that grain. So they got all that food. You might ask, why didn't Pharaoh just give them the food instead of taking their livestock and their land? Instead of having them become slaves? Free stuff is easily wasted. And they had limited resources, and they wanted to make sure the needs of the people were met. Free stuff is easily wasted, and there was a limited supply. Imagine how many would have starved if it had been wasted because it was free. Go to a buffet sometime. And then just look at the tables in the restaurant as you're walking out that other people have left behind. And see how many pizza crusts are there. See how many half-finished servings of mashed potatoes are there. You see how easily stuff is wasted when you have all you can eat. Free stuff is easily wasted. So you could look at it on the one side, say Pharaoh was greedy for not just giving it to him because he had all of it. But if he started just giving it, how many people would have took advantage of how much he was giving? And how many people would have went through the line twice or three times and then turned around and sold it themselves? Think about that. Human nature. Greed is part of human nature. That's why we have to be warned about it in Scripture. That's why we have to look at our own hearts and realize how easy it would be for greed to be there. Imagine how many would have starved if it had been wasted because it was free, or how many other people would have been exploited even worse. I don't know how much grain he gave them in exchange for their cattle, but imagine if he was giving it away for free and then some scoundrel was getting a corner on that free grain and was charging them even more for their cattle and the better ones. Would have that been economic justice? The point I'm making is these aren't always easy answers when you're trying to set policy. I'm glad that it was Joseph and Pharaoh that set the policy, or Joseph that set the policy. I don't believe it was Pharaoh. Pharaoh owned the stuff, but it was Joseph who set the policy. But I'm glad it was Joseph that set the policy here, and that I didn't have to come up with it and try to decide what was fair. These things aren't easy. That's one of the reasons why I encourage you, pray for your government leaders. It's really easy for us to be critical of our government leaders as they're trying to implement policy. But pray for them. It isn't always easy. There are often debates about price gouging during times of disaster. How many of you have ever heard of huge natural disaster, maybe a hurricane, and people loading up generators and driving down to the Gulf or driving to Florida with a whole load of generators from here in the Midwest? And the reason they do that is they realize we can get paid well for our time. So they load up the generators, and they might drive 10 hours, farther possibly. So they got a lot invested into those generators. And they got a lot of fuel. And they may have had to take time off of work that they didn't get paid for, but they're hoping to recoup that by taking that load of generators down there. So they get down there. What's a fair price for the generator? These people need the generators. What would be fair? They've already lost so much. The fair thing would be to just give them away free, wouldn't it? But remember, this guy had to buy the generators. He had to take time off work. He had fuel to get down there. He had wear and tear in his truck to haul them down there. What's fair? All of a sudden, they find out that there's been a declaration, no price gouging allowed. You guys sell them for retail price. And that declaration, the guy hears about it just before he's ready to leave with that load of generators. And he knows that he can bring them back to the store and return them. And then go back to work the rest of the week. So he goes back to the store and returns it and never delivers the generators because he knows he can't get compensation for them. He knows it's not going to work out economically. Now you can sit here and say, okay, this guy shouldn't care about that. He should just care about the needs of the people. But he's got bills to pay at the end of the month, and he was already making sacrifices to try to do that. Maybe he was only going to break even doing it, but he would have to charge more than retail price in order for him to even break even. Here's the problem, those people don't get the generators. That's where sometimes our compassion can end up limiting the help that's needed. So what's fair? Those aren't easy answers. And a lot of times the people would have been willing to pay 5 times the amount of a generator just so they had one. So the food didn't spoil in their freezers. And maybe there was 3 neighbors got together to buy a generator so they could share it to keep their freezers plugged in. And so they're willing to pay that extra. Because they're so limited of a supply. These answers aren't easy. How do we find economic justice? We need to pray for leaders who are implementing policies. We need to pray that Christians do the right thing. Pharaoh is enriched, much wealth has been gained, but people are fed and the famine is over. They are not dead. But here's an important principle we need to look at. Once the famine is over, what does Pharaoh do? He doesn't continue to take advantage of them. In fact, they are given seed and as well given motivation to plant that seed and to be rewarded for hard work as they start over. He does something very important. He gives them hope. I want you to stop and think about that word hope for a moment. When you're trying to figure out what's fair and you're trying to help people in need, have compassion and give them hope. Verses 23 through 26, it says, Then Joseph said to the people, Behold, I have today brought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now there is seed for you, and you may sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So they said, You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. And Pharaoh made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th only. It should have the 5th, Only the land of the priests did not have pharaohs. The fifth, that means they had to give 20% of the crop to Pharaoh. He essentially imposed a 20% tax upon them. Or you could say he had them become sharecroppers. And as the landlord, he only wanted 20%. That isn't much. That isn't much at all. And he furnished the seed for the first year anyway. After that, they had to get their own seed. But he gave them hope. It was a good deal for them. In fact, even in our country, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the combined labor tax burden just for payroll and federal income tax is 28.4%. Now, not everybody pays that. Some people don't pay any income tax. But there's withholding and other taxes. There's sales tax, property taxes, state taxes. I mean, the point I'm making is Joseph and Pharaoh were being very fair, even according to our modern standards here in the United States. Just to pause for a moment, it's easy to complain about taxes here, but we still have hope. We still have hope. And that's why so many people want to come and live here. But back to Genesis, the people are being incentivized to work hard, to produce more because they get to keep most of it. Joseph isn't asking for all of it. Think of it. If he was asking for all of it and keeping much of it and then dividing it equally between all of them, they wouldn't have had the incentive. And there are economic systems that approach things that way. That's not what Joseph is doing here. He's giving them hope. The more land they plant and harvest, in other words, the harder they work, the more they get to keep. Even after all they have lost, an industrious person would have an opportunity to again become prosperous. And that's exactly what Joseph's family does. They become prosperous. They have hope. They're able to get ahead. Look at verses 27 through 28. It says, now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property. They acquired property. All the property had been lost because the people had to give it up for food. But now, as they are able to keep 80% of what they grow, they're able to gain wealth. And if they really work hard, the harder they work, the more they gain. And they're able to acquire property. Anybody could have done that. But Israel especially did that. They worked hard and acquired property. Again, verse 27. Now, Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property, and in it were fruitful, and became very numerous. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. Remember, they didn't own property when they came to Egypt. And by the time the famine is over, hardly anyone owned property. Only the priests owned property. But because of the opportunity that Joseph and Pharaoh had set up, those who worked hard could gain wealth and get property. And that's what Jacob's family does. Throughout history, too many countries have set up caste systems where only certain classes could have wealth. Even communism is no exception to that. No wonder so many people want to move to places where they have hope, where they can actually get their own property. We should be thankful that we have the freedoms we have here. But we need to use those freedoms to care about others rather than being greedy. No system is perfect. And no matter what system we're in, we should care about those in need. And remember that the only perfect system will be when Jesus returns and rules. But let us be thankful for what Pharaoh and Joseph did for the people during and after the famine. And let it motivate us to set aside greed and to look for what is in the best interest of those in need. Let us be more concerned with how fair we are personally than even the policies of the government. Because sometimes voting can be an excuse to say, well, I did my duty in economic justice. I voted for those who I think will do the best job. No, that isn't your whole duty. It's even more important that you love your neighbors yourself and that you implement these principles of economic justice in places far than the voting booth. So when you apply economic principles in your interaction with others, be careful not to be greedy. Be careful that you do not stifle hope, nor should you allow others to guilt you into stifling your own hope because of their greed. Let us strive to be Christ-like stewards, and let us love others. I don't have the answers to the best economic principles. I don't have the wisdom that Joseph had. And I definitely don't have the wisdom that Christ has. None of us do. None of our leaders do. We look throughout history, we look throughout the world, and we look at different approaches. And yet the poor are among us. No matter what economic principle is applied, the poor are among us. So rather than looking for the solution that will solve the problem of the poor, let us look first in the mirror and say, what can I do to help those in need? How can I help my neighbor? How can I be loving? Let's strive to be Christ-like. I'm going to give you a few moments to reflect on that. After you've had a few moments, ask Tyler, would you close us with a word of prayer?